Perhaps one of the greatest trainers in boxing history. This man trained George Godfrey. George Godfrey became the colored heavyweight champion. Phenomenal fighter was George Godfrey. Jackie Fields was a welterweight out of Chicago. He resided in Las Vegas, Nevada. He would become a welterweight champion of the world under the tutelage of this great trainer. Fantastic trainer he was. He would train Bud Taylor out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. Bud Taylor was a phenomenal bantamweight, and he would become a champion with the tutelage of this great trainer. Besides Sammy Mandel becoming a champion when he defeated Rocky Kansas, Jersey Joe Walcott would also become champion. From the tricks of the trade that he would learn from this great trainer, Joe Walcott would defeat Ezzard Charles in 1951. He would hit him with a bodacious left hook. And a left hook was one of the qualities of this great trainer. The most recognizable fighter to be trained by this great man would be Joe Louis. Joe Louis would have 25 title defenses. He'd be champion for 12 years. 11 years and 11 and a half months. Be one of the greatest combination punchers in the history of the game. And he would refer to his trainer as Chappie. Jack Blackburn. Perhaps one of the greatest trainers of all times. And an outstanding Hall of Famer. Great lightweight. Fought them all. I'm Scrapbook Boxing, and I want to get into the career of Jack Blackburn, nicknamed Chappie. I would like to discuss his career right here on the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. What a fighter, what a trainer. Unbelievable career he had. Let's take a look at his story. Charles Henry Blackburn, nicknamed Chappie, better known as Jack Blackburn. Born May 20th, 1884 in Kentucky. He died April 24th, 1942. He was 59 years of age at the time of his death. He would suffer from a heart attack, walk around with 2 weeks of pneumonia. He was a hard man, lived a very rough life. And for the age of 50, he looked like he was living a life of a 100-year-old man. He stood 5 foot 10 inches and he weighed 135 to 160 pounds. He was managed by Dick Kane. Now, Jack Blackburn, by many old-time historians, have fought well over 400 fights. But he only has 166 recorded fights in his resume. He had 113 wins, 32 knockouts, and 25 losses. And he would face some of the greatest men of his time. Men like Sam Langford, the Boston Tar Baby. Sam Langford, I have ranked number 1 as the greatest fighter of all time. These men would face each other 6 times. Now they would fight December 23rd, 1903. It'd be a 12-round pre-arranged draw. Now in those days, they set up a lot of pre-arranged draws, which means if you didn't knock an opponent out, it would automatically go to a draw, or sometimes a no contest, or even a no decision based on the circumstances. They would face each other in Central Athletic Club in Boston, Massachusetts. They would also face each other January 11th, 1904, 6-round draw in a Washington Sporting Club in Philadelphia. They would face each other September 9th, 1904, 15-round draw, Marsboro Opera House in Massachusetts. These men would have a ball with one another. Sam Langford, like I said, I have the greatest fighter of all times. He was the IBU heavyweight champion, Mexican heavyweight champion, Australian heavyweight champion, colored heavyweight champion, colored middleweight champion. He fought them all. Phenomenal fighter was Sam Langford. And he become an opponent of Charles Henry Blackburn, better known as Jack Blackburn. Salute to Sam Langford. Jack Blackburn would face Joe Gans, who I have ranked number 1, along with Benny Leonard, as the greatest lightweight champion of all times. He faced him twice. They fought March 25th, 1904. And Blackburn would lose to Joe Gans in 15 rounds. Baltimore, Maryland. But then they would face each other again December 31st, 1903. And Jack Blackburn would defeat Joe Gans. He would hit him to the body. He would move around on Joe Gans. But you couldn't find a greater fighter than Joe Gans. As a matter of fact, Jack Blackburn learned so many tricks that he would pass on to his proteges. And the greatest protege he would have would be Joe Louis. And a trick he would show Joe Louis about hand speed is how to catch a fly. Because Joe Gans would teach Jack Blackburn. He would hang a piece of meat outside of the back porch, attracting flies, and he would show him the proper way to catch the flies. One shot. And Blackburn would teach Joe Louis this trick. Joe Louis missed the flies several times, but after so many weeks of training, he would finally get it. And he would finally earn the name as Chappie, the same name of Jack Blackburn. And before you know it, Joe Louis would be knocking out all his sparring partners because they never saw the punch coming. Phenomenal trick he learned from Joe Gans, one of the greatest lightweights of all times. Jack Blackburn would face Harry Greb, the Pittsburgh Windmill. He would face him January 25th, 1915. He would face him in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That would be the hometown of Harry Greb. And Jack Blackburn would lose a 6-round decision. It would be a newspaper decision, the Pittsburgh Post. Now you see, the problem was Harry Greb was an offensive fighter. He would never stop throwing punches. He was well calculated. He would move side to side, front and back, but he would never stop throwing punches. Well calculated was Harry Greb. Jack Blackburn was just the opposite. He was a defensive fighter. Pick off punches. Feint, move. And Harry Greb would outpoint him. A small margin. But he would win on points, according to the Pittsburgh Post. Several times, Jack Blackburn had hurt Harry Greb. 3rd round and the 5th round. But Greb just outpointed him. Harry Greb I have ranked number 2 as the greatest fighter of all times. Right behind the Boston Tar Baby, Sam Langford. Jack Blackburn would also face Panama Joe Gans. Panama Joe Gans would hold the colored middleweight championship belt from 1920 to 1924. Blackburn would have a 3-inch reach advantage on Panama Joe Gans. That would be some fight. Now, I did a profile on Panama Joe Gans. Type in Panama Joe Gans Scrapbook Boxing. You'll learn what you need to know about Panama Joe Gans. Now, a local promoter was looking for some colored talent for his main event. And he was told about a skinny, tall, lightweight And this skinny tall lightweight's name was Jack Blackburn. And his first opponent was Kid Miller. Now these two young men were the highlight of the saloon bars. Now that's where Jack Blackburn fought a lot of his opponents, probably 130 opponents in the saloons and the back bars. And a lot of these fights were unrecorded. But Jack Blackburn would take it to Kid Miller. And the way he fought him, he would cause Kid Miller to quit in the 8th round. And Jack was paid $2.10 for his night's work. Jack Blackburn fought all over Indianapolis. He would develop the name as a fair prospect in the Midwest. Blackburn's first big contest was opponent by the name of Kid Ash, a lightweight with a very strong pedigree. He had a great deal of experience, and they would face each other in 1902. Now, Kid Ash showed Jack a thing or two. He razzled and dazzled him through body punch and headshots, and he moved from side to side. And Jack Blackburn was unfamiliar to these tactics, but he was a very quick learner, and he caught on very quickly. And he also learned some dirty tricks along the way. And he would bring that experience to Steve Crosby. Now, at that time, he was considered Indianapolis' finest. Blackburn would give Crosby all of the work he can handle. Now, Joe Gans, who we talked about before, would come in town and challenge Indianapolis' best. And Jack Blackburn was highly recommended for this task. The fight was a close 12-round draw. You see, Joe Gans, at this point of his career, knew all the tricks of the trade. And although Jack Blackburn was taller than he, and he had a pretty good jab, but he couldn't outthink Joe Gans, because Joe Gans set up traps. He was consistent. He knew where to place his punches. And if you look at some of the fight films of Joe Gans, you'll understand what I'm talking about. And Jack Blackburn was still learning on the job, although he might have had over 100 fights at this point. Unrecorded fights, I should add. But Joe Gans would get the nod. January 8th, 1904. Now, by 1903, Jack decided that he had outgrown Indianapolis and moved to Philadelphia. And after trying Pittsburgh, he realized, with the advice of George Cole, and I did a profile on George Cole, type in George Cole Scrapbook Boxing as well. George Cole was out of Trenton, New Jersey. He was a brilliant welterweight. He had a fine career in his own right. He advised Jack Blackburn, if he wanted to accomplish his goals of being a star in boxing, he would have to fight in Philadelphia. And Blackburn then connected with a newspaper man by the name of Dick Kane, who would later become his manager. Jack began his first fight in Philadelphia, soon to be the great fighter named Dave Holly. Now, Dave Holly was a devastating genius fighter. He was a spoiler for out-of-town fighters in his day. He would catch them coming in green. And Jack Blackburn's problem with the Philadelphia fighters was that he was a defensive fighter. Philadelphia fighters were always offensive. When you look at Joe Frazier and Meldrick Taylor and others, they were all offensive fighters. And Dave Holly would outpoint Jack Blackburn. Although Jack Blackburn was well complimented because he had the tools, he had the basics, but he couldn't outpoint these fighters. And Dave Holly would be the victor. May 4th, 1903. The bout with Dave Holly was a newspaper decision at the Philadelphia Sporting Club. November 21st, 1903. Newspaper decision, National Athletic Club, also in Philadelphia. August 26, 1904, Manhattan Athletic Club. January 20th, 1905, non-title bout. January 10th, 1906, he defeated Holly at the National Sporting Club in Washington, Delaware. 6-round newspaper decision. You see, all the fights that he would face Dave Holly, he would win one. Because as I said, he would eventually learn. And that's how he became one of the greatest fighters of all times. He would face Larry Temple in a prearranged draw. And this would be at the Marlboro Theater in Marlboro, Massachusetts. Unless the knockout occurred, it would become a draw. On January 8th, 1904, Blackburn drew with black boxer Sam Bolden, 142 pounds. Jack would lose the world welterweight champion Mike Twin Sullivan. This is about Chelsea Athletic Club in Massachusetts. And that would be really his only opportunity outside of Joe Gans to win a title. Now, Jack Brown would also face Dave Holly once again. He fought him to a standstill and was quickly rejected. He was respected by everyone in that audience. The Philly natives understood what Jack Blackburn was about. After defeating several opponents, he was set to face Spike Sullivan. Many felt that Jack won the fight, but he would be robbed of a decision. Blackburn's issue was, as I stated, he was a defensive fighter. And he couldn't break that trend of becoming an offensive fighter because that's how he was successful, picking off punches, setting up traps to get his man to throw a punch and countering him. But in Philadelphia, you couldn't do that because they would make you fight every second of the round. And the news writers were very in tune with the hometown Sullivan. Now, Blackburn would always be a defensive fighter and never plan on changing his style because it always worked for him. And he found out that he had to reside in changing his style if he was to face Joe Gans again. Now, champion Joe Gans this time would have to make some adjustments. He caused Joe Gans to counter him, causing Jack Blackburn to make the first move. Joe Gans was very fast with his hands and sharp with his mind. He was very precise and aware. He thought like a cat. And Joe Gans was just a phenomenal fighter all around. And to the death of Jack Blackburn, he would always respect Joe Gans. Now, in 1909, Jack was living with a white woman. Her name was Maud Pillin. Now, Jack would claim her as his common-law wife. Now, Jack and Maud had an argument with another couple by the name of Alonzo and Marie Polk. Jack Blackburn was drinking heavily one night. And for some reason, he decided that he wanted to finish the argument. So he would go over to the Polk residence and he would send Maud through the front door as a distraction. You see, Jack Blackburn would decide to hide in the bushes for an ambush. And when Maud would ring the bell, wife Maddie would answer the door. And these two would get it on in the yard. And Jack Blackburn would jump out of the bushes to try and break up the fight. Meanwhile, Maddie would call for her husband, Alonzo. And when Jack Blackburn leaped from the bushes, out came a pistol, a revolver. And Maud, face was scratched from the tussle and bustle of the fight with Maddie. So Jack Blackburn would rush his wife over to the hospital. And he remembered he didn't have his pistol with him, so he ran back only to find out that Alonzo was dead. And when he got to the house, a black cop was already waiting there for him. He would arrest him. In trying to arrest him, Jack Blackburn fought back. So he was accused and charged of battery, assault of a police officer, and first-degree murder. Jack Blackburn would eventually be charged with murder, but he was convicted of manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 to 15 years in prison before being released. But he would be released in 4 years and 8 months for good behavior. You see, he would teach the warden and his sons how to box. And Blackburn would continue with his career. Now, he was eventually introduced into the Boxing Hall of Fame and International Boxing Hall of Fame, because he would face Sam Langford 6 times, George Cole 3 times, Dave Harley 5 times, Larry Temple 2 times. Joe Burrell was originally from New York, and he would move to Philadelphia. Fought him 2 times. He fought George Gunther 5 times. Amazing. 1-time middleweight champion Harry Greb. Harry Greb became champion in 1923 when he defeated Johnny Wilson. 1-time color light heavyweight champion Kid Norfolk. He fought Ed Gunboat Smith, Panama Joe Gans. He lost July 24th, 1922 in Indianapolis in 14 rounds. Cleve Hawkins. Steve Crosby, Harry Lenny, Jim Barry, Mike Donovan, Terry Martin, Herman Miller, Harry Hairpin Lewis, Cy Flynn, Joe Grimm, very dirty fighter, Tommy Howell. Blackburn will retire as a fighter in 1923. And he would train fighters such as Joe Walcott, Joe Louis, Mickey Walker, Sammy Mandel, Bud Taylor, John Henry Lewis, Jackie Fields, Lou Tendler, great lightweight southpaw from Philadelphia. Now, how he met Joe Louis. He was training Joe Walcott, and he got a telegram that a young man was being sent over right after the amateurs from Grubb's Gym on 116th Street in Harlem to meet him in Philadelphia. Now, Joe Louis was brought to him. Joe's first trained in Detroit's Brewster Center. It was Brewster's Recreational Center. He was introduced to that gym by a childhood friend by the name of Thurston McKinney. And he would introduce him while reading a book. And he came across a newspaper. In fact, it was the same kind of a newspaper that Henry Armstrong would notice when hitting him on the leg working for a railroad. It said that Kid Chocolate earned $75,000. So Thurston McKinley would show Joe Louis that newspaper article, and he would walk him right in to Brewster Center. And after a few years of winning some amateur titles, Julian Black would get Joe Louis and bring him over to Jack Blackburn. Now, as soon as Joe Louis walked into the gymnasium, Jack Blackburn would tell Joe Louis to switch handbags. Take your gym bag from the right hand and move it to the left hand, and move it back to the right hand. And what he was doing was getting the balance in check for Joe Louis. And when Joe Louis would walk into the gym every day, a young man would carry his violin case. That young man's name was Walker Smith. Walker Smith would eventually become Sugar Ray Robinson. And Joe Louis would be taught the proper way to throw combinations on a bag. He would be brought outside the back porch to grab flies from a meat that was hanging from the roof. He would learn balance, having a medicine ball between his knees and hitting the heavy bag at the same time. He would have a string, first 3 inches, and then 6 inches, and then 9 inches apart. And that's where he would learn to shuffle. And before you know it, Joe Louis was knocking out all the sparring partners that he was facing. And Joe Louis would eventually earn the name by Jack Blackburn Chappie. Joe's first fight was against Jack Cracklin in Chicago. And it was the test for Jack Blackburn. Since then, he faced Max Baer, former heavyweight champion. He would knock him out in 4 rounds. Beautiful triple left hook on the way down. Max Baer, he became heavyweight champion when he knocked out Primo Carnera. They both went down 11 times, and he would defeat Carnera in 11 rounds. He would lose his title to the Cinderella Man, James Braddock. But he would face Joe Louis in 1935 and be knocked out in the 4th round. Joe Louis would be in the ring with Bronx, New York native Bob Pastor, another very good fighter. But that would be another opponent on the way to the championship for Joe Louis. He would face another former champion, Jack Sharkey, and he would knock him out in 2 brutal rounds. Jack Sharkey was absolutely no match for Joe Louis. He would win the title for Max Schmeling and lose the title to Primo Carnera. Primo Carnera would be knocked out by Joe Louis in 6 rounds. He would defeat Jack Sharkey for the heavyweight championship belt and knock him out in 6 rounds. And he himself would be knocked out by Max Baer. But Joe Louis would hit Primo Carnera so hard that he would fracture his ankle. Perhaps the man that Joe Louis would have the most problems with would be a former heavyweight champion from Germany, the Black Ulan, Max Schmeling in 1936. Joe Louis would be knocked out in 12 rounds. Joe Louis would be smashed in 1936. But Jack Blackburn would quickly explain to Joe Louis that you have to take boxing seriously. And what Max Schmeling saw was that Joe Louis was dropping his left jab every time he threw it. So what Max Schmeling would do is let Joe Louis throw the jab, and as Joe Louis was throwing the right hand, Max Schmeling would beat him to it. And that was the destruction of Joe Louis. (1938). Joe Louis wins by a first-round knockout. He had learned his lesson because Harlem didn't let him forget that they were rooting for him. Max Schmeling, the Black Hewlin, be the only fighter to defeat Joe Louis. Before 1950, when Eddie Charles would defeat Joe Louis and solidify his heavyweight championship title. Harlem would go crazy when Joe Louis would become heavyweight champion by knocking out Jimmy Braddock in 1937. And that would be the same year that Henry Armstrong would win the featherweight championship belt from P.D. Cerrone. Joe Louis would make good as heavyweight champion, knocking out the majority of his opponents. He had bypassed it down in the first time in the first round. Phenomenal fighter was Joe Louis, a protege of Chappie, Jack Blackburn. Now, Jack Blackburn would die in 1942. And at his funeral would be Julian Black and Mike Jacobs, among many old-time fighters, show their respects. Now, Jack Blackburn would be laid to rest they would have his burial and his eulogies all in Chicago at Pilgrim's Baptist Church, April 29, 1942. But he was laid to rest in Chicago, Lincoln Cemetery. He'd be inducted into the World Boxing Hall of Fame 1992, not as a fighter, but as a renowned trainer. Now, I can never understand why Jack Blackburn was never inducted as a fighter. He should have been, because he took on the greatest fighters of his time. And he was so well respected that Richard Roundtree would play Jack Blackburn and Max and Joe, 2002. An outstanding movie that I own. And in 1953, in a movie, The Joe Louis Story, James Edwards would play Jack Blackburn. So I entered Jack Blackburn in the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series because he was an outstanding fighter and an outstanding trainer. Salute to Jack Blackburn. Scrapbook Boxing. Stating all great fights and all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. Salute to my subscribers. Salute to this fantastic icon. One of the greatest trainers in the entire history of the game. Jack Blackburn.